By the mid-1950s, the Irish influence on criminal activity had dwindled. The mafia now had the upper hand.
By this time, there really wasn't much of what you would call an organized Irish-American unit. There was nothing comparable to the mafia in terms of the Irish-American gangster in the 1950s. Whatever structure had existed back in the 20s and 30s had long since died out.
There remained some powerful Irish criminal gangs in cities like New York and Boston. But aside from that, the mafia reigned supreme. One of the most valued Irishmen in the mafia was Frank the Irishman Sheeran. Sheeran operated within the mafia for over 30 years.
Frank Sheeran would have been a classic case of Irish-American gangsters that were tough enough to operate as lone wolves within the underworld structure.
In 2003, while on his deathbed, Frank Sheeran began to tell his story to his lawyer. He spoke about the work he did for the mob and the Teamsters Union, and his friendship with Teamster boss Jimmy Hoffa. He talked about the dispute between Hoffa and the Kennedys, and how he claimed the mob were behind the assassination of JFK, and about being pressurized by the mob into killing his old friend Jimmy Hoffa, when Hoffa himself started causing trouble.
I think Sheeran's story holds together, and he did, in fact, kill Hoffa, and he did it only because he had no choice.
Frank Sheeran was born on October 25th, 1920, in Derby, Pennsylvania, a small mining town on the outskirts of Philadelphia. He had left school by the time he was 16, expelled for breaking the principal's jaw. He enlisted in the army in August 1941, and by the end of that year, America was embroiled in World War II.
Sheeran was in combat during World War II for 411 days, which has to be a record. The average amount of combat for infantrymen who were in Europe in World War II was 100 days.
On his return to Philadelphia at the age of 25, he had seen a world of killing and crime and found it very hard to settle into normal life. In order to support his family, Frank took a job with the drivers' union, the Teamsters.
Frank initially went to work as a rank-and-file union member with the Teamsters and showed that he had a certain talent for physical activity, both as a worker and also in terms of violence related to the underworld.
Frank was slowly being drawn into another way of life. He was often away from home, spending a lot of his time with his Italian co-workers in the area of Philadelphia known as Little Italy, where he met Russell Bufalino.
Bufalino was a major mob family member in this country. There essentially were, and probably still are, 5 major Cosa Nostra families. And Bufalino, while linked in some ways to the Genovese family, really was outside all of them and looked upon as kind of the elder statesman when they had troubles. Bufalino, who was no dumbbell, saw, I think, in Sheeran a completely fearless guy, as well as a bright guy.
Sheeran's friendship with Bufalino drew him closer to the mafia, and before long he was working for them full-time, but his home life was suffering. He now had 3 daughters, but he had no interest in his wife and family, and he deserted them. The mob was Sheeran's family now, and they introduced him to one of the most powerful men in America.
Russ Bufalino recommended Sheeran to Jimmy Hoffa, the powerful, colorful president of the Teamsters. Hoffa's first words on the phone were, "I heard you paint houses." Paint your house in mob language means to kill as a hired killer. And the expression really comes because in theory and maybe in practice, paint splatters, or blood, which is the paint, splatters all over the house.
That very night, Sheeran flew to Detroit to work for Jimmy Hoffa.
Jimmy Hoffa was undoubtedly the best-known labor leader in American history. The Teamsters, America's largest, strongest, most strategically placed, most swaggering, most colorful, and most crooked union that the world has ever known.
And I don't intend to have the impression left that's been stated publicly that I'm controlled by gangsters. I am not controlled by them.
Hoffa, as president of the Teamsters Union, was sort of the overlord of the Teamsters Pension Fund. And so it became a kind of an underworld banking source in the 50s and 60s. The birth of Las Vegas, for instance, was financed greatly through use of the Teamsters Pension Fund.
The Teamsters Union under Jimmy Hoffa was the mob's golden goose, and they used men like Frank Sheeran to keep a tight rein on union affairs.
Sheeran could be trusted to be quiet about it. He didn't ask questions. He was a tough guy, and he was extremely loyal. And Hoffa was very much admired by Sheeran. Sheeran said there were only two people in his life whom he really gave total respect to. Russell Bufalino was one, and Jimmy Hoffa was the other. And Sheeran, although he was essentially a soldier in the ranks, so to speak, was a very close soldier, confidant and friend of Jimmy Hoffa's. When Hoffa needed a little personal protection, even though he was loath to admit he was afraid of anything, and I really think he was a very fearless guy. I don't need no bodyguards. Well, Hoffa don't need no bodyguards. He said, I'll be okay as long as I have the Irishman with me, and that was Frank Sheeran. Sheeran was the guy he relied on.
Hoffa put his trust in Sheeran as he settled problems for him daily, but there was a big problem on the horizon that Sheeran wouldn't be able to handle: the Kennedys. The Kennedys were preparing to go after the mob, and Frank Sheeran was about to become involved in an event that would change world history forever. The authorities were intensifying their campaign against the mob, and Jimmy Hoffa was public enemy number one.
I'm not satisfied when I see men like Jimmy Hoffa in charge of the largest union in the United States, still free.
Sheeran learned of the hatred between Hoffa and the Kennedys, a history that dated back to the McClellan Committee hearings.
The McClellan Committee was constituted specifically to deal with racketeering in interstate commerce in the United States, and that meant dealing very specifically with the activities of the Teamsters Union. And Bobby Kennedy let it be known that the person that he saw as the main source, if not the sole source, of corruption in the Teamsters Union was Jimmy Hoffa.
Did you make that statement after these people testified before the committee?
I never talked to either one of them.
Jimmy Hoffa had a sense of the historical parameters of the underworld, and he knew that Bobby Kennedy's father, Joseph Kennedy, had a long series of relationships with underworld figures. Joe Kennedy was able to reach back into his years of associations with criminal figures and exert the kind of influence that was needed to turn out money and votes in major cities in the United States, and set up a series of meetings with underworld figures in New York and in Boston and Chicago to help get his son elected president of the United States.
The mob promised him that support, on condition that Bobby Kennedy would lessen or withdraw the vendetta he pursued against the mafia during the 1950s. It was Frank Sheeran who brought the news to Hoffa that the mob were about to make a deal with the Kennedys.
When Jimmy Hoffa became privy to the fact that Sam Giancana and other members of the mafia were going to use their influence to try to help get John Kennedy elected president, he was livid. There was a meeting that took place in Chicago, I believe. Frank Sheeran, by this time, was close to Jimmy Hoffa. You might even say was a bodyguard of Jimmy Hoffa's. He was at this meeting that took place between Sam Giancana and Jimmy Hoffa to discuss what they were going to do about John Kennedy's campaign for president of the United States.
Sheeran listened as Giancana said he'd fix the election in Illinois so Kennedy would win. Hoffa tried to talk him out of it. The Kennedys could not be trusted.
A record number of Americans, upwards of 67 million, go to the polls to elect the 35th President of the United States. Not till the middle of the next day was the victory clinched by one of the closest margins recorded, a plurality of barely over 300,000.
One of the first things John Kennedy does as president is he appoints his brother, Bobby Kennedy, Attorney General of the United States. So this sets off alarm bells all throughout the underworld. He's made Bobby Kennedy his #1 law enforcement person. This does not look good. And it doesn't take long at all for the mob's worst fears to be realized.
Bobby continued what the Teamsters always called a vendetta against Jimmy Hoffa by setting up a group of, at one time, 21 of the best lawyers, as the expression goes, that money can buy, and given one mandate to devote their full time to, and that is get Hoffa behind bars.
The Kennedys were creating great difficulties. Difficulties that were too big for Frank Sheeran to handle alone.
Among the major mob leaders in this country, Hoffa knew plenty of them, but one controlled all of South Florida, a fellow named Santos Traficante, and the other was a fellow from New Orleans named Carlos Marcello, both very close friends of Hoffa's, both hating, for whatever reasons, the Kennedys, and both had said that they would like to help their friend Hoffa out.
There was a meeting in New Orleans in which Carlos Marcello made the statement to an associate of his that we're going to take care of our Kennedy problem. He was referring to Bobby Kennedy, so his associate assumed that he was talking about an assassination of Bobby Kennedy. And he said, you can't do that. If you kill Bobby Kennedy, then the President of the United States is going to come after you. And Carlos Marcello made the now famous statement of, well, if you want to kill a dog, a rabid dog, you don't cut off the tail, you cut off the head. And this was a reference to the fact that the mob was going to kill not Bobby Kennedy, but John Kennedy. They were going to go over the head of Bobby Kennedy and kill the president.
The wheels were already in motion, and Frank Sheeran would play a part in the fateful events which would change the world forever. At the start of November 1963, a short time before JFK was killed, Frank Sheeran received a call from Jimmy Hoffa. He was to meet Russell Bufalino, as there was another job to be done. He collected a bag, which he was to bring to a private airstrip in Baltimore. The bag contained 3 rifles.
We'll never know specifically who is behind what happened on November 22nd, 1963. But what we do know is various factions of the mob and the Teamsters Union had serious disagreements with the Kennedy administration, disagreements to the point where they felt that their very existence was at stake. And so a series of events were put into play involving Carlos Marcello and Sam Giancana and Santo Traficante, and quite possibly augmented by Jimmy Hoffa, that lead up to the assassination of John Kennedy.
If the mob did orchestrate Kennedy's assassination, their curse followed his brother Bobby too. Without JFK, his power was gone, but before he left office, he vowed to put one man behind bars.
Jimmy Hoffa was found guilty of 2 different things at 2 different trials in 1964. He did indeed go to jail and was sentenced to serve 5 to 8 years and was released in 4 years, 9 months, and 18 days. And during that entire period, Frank Sheeran, above all, did troubleshooting jobs for Hoffa, getting messages sometimes to Russ Bufalino.
Frank Sheeran visited Hoffa regularly in prison, but with Hoffa behind bars, the mob had more control of the unions, which were now under Frank Fitzsimmons' command.
Fitzsimmons allowed the mob, after Hoffa went to jail, to get more deeply into the pension fund and all that money which built Las Vegas, Nevada, and did many other things. Much more than Hoffa ever did. Hoffa could say no to the mob, always, as well as yes to the mob. And Hoffa broke with the mob, and as he tried to come back when he was out of jail to become Teamster president, he reportedly was talking to Justice Department officials in a quid pro quo for being allowed to come back as president. And the word went out, and we're now speaking of 1974 into 5, that Hoffa had to be taken care of.
Hoffa's return was not welcomed by many, especially Bufalino. Sheeran was now caught in the middle. He was torn between loyalty to his friend and his loyalty to the mob.
Russ Bufalino warned Hoffa not to come back as Teamster president because there are too many people who wanted to get rid of him. And Sheeran was very much present, although quiet, in those discussions. He was with Hoffa not too long afterwards when Bufalino suggested that he personally talk to Hoffa. And Sheeran privately also told Hoffa just before the big day, July 30th, 1975, you can't do it, Jim. You won't live.
Jimmy Hoffa's number was up. Bufalino had requested Frank Sheeran would get rid of Hoffa, leaving Sheeran caught between a rock and a hard place. He had no choice.
Sheeran realized, and it didn't take long, that if he didn't do this job, he would be killed.
Jimmy Hoffa is called to a sit-down with Bufalino and another mafioso by the name of Anthony Provenzano. And Frank Sheeran is going to bring Jimmy Hoffa to this meeting.
Sheeran picked Hoffa up from the car park of the Macus Red Fox restaurant outside Detroit and drove him to a house where the meeting was to take place.
They drive to this house. It's a very kind of anonymous middle-class house in a middle-class neighborhood. And Jimmy opens the door and walks into the house, and Frank Sheeran is behind him. Frank Sheeran puts his gun to the base of Jimmy Hoffa's head and shoots his friend in the head and kills Jimmy Hoffa.
Certainly the most convincing case I've ever heard is that Sheeran was indeed the guy who killed Jimmy Hoffa. It broke his heart to do it, but he had no choice.
Sheeran claimed Hoffa's body was taken to a crematorium for disposal. No remains have ever been found.
It did affect him greatly. It devastated him. He was always a drinker, but he turned to very heavy drinking after that. And got old very, very fast.
The murder of Jimmy Hoffa is one of the greatest unsolved crimes in American history. The FBI put 200 agents on the Hoffa case, but no one was ever charged with his murder.
The Hoffa investigation involved several key suspects, but the only guy who really knew firsthand would have been the Irishman, Frank Sheeran. And the hope was, through the 80s, 90s, that someday somebody would give a deathbed confession. And the Sheeran story is a deathbed confession. He did it when he was dying. He wanted to be right with his maker, as he regularly said. And everything that I know certainly convinces me Sheeran did the deed.
Frank the Irishman Sheeran died 3 days after confessing to the murder of Jimmy Hoffa. His story shows the extent of the mafia's power in America throughout the 1960s and 70s. But from the mid-70s on, it would be the Italians coming under attack. The authorities vowed to wipe out the mafia, and in cities like New York and Boston, the Irish mob were going to help them do it.
NBC's Ashley Banfield has more.
The FBI today increased the reward being offered for information leading to the capture of fugitive Irish mobster James Whitey Bulger. On the run since 1994, the price on Bulger's head now stands at $2 million. Whitey is wanted
for 20 years, one man ran the city of Boston. He controlled the cops, the politicians, and the criminals. His name was James Joseph Bulger, but on the streets of Boston, he was simply known as Whitey.
Well, the Bulger family is kind of a classic Irish-American story. I mean, within that family you had the two brothers, James Bulger, the criminal, and William Billy Bulger, the politician. Their skills were equal and similar in many ways, but they just applied them to entirely different avenues of advancement.
Whitey became a master at his game, which was the underworld, while his younger brother Billy became all-powerful and a master in his, and that was the political world.
The story of Whitey Bulger is one of family, loyalty and corruption that has its roots in the tight-knit Irish community of South Boston, known as Southie.
South Boston was the place where the Irish were. They went there. And it sees itself as being a place apart from the city, apart from the country. It's physically an island, and mentally, in a psychological sense, it's an island too. It's particularly clannish.
Like thousands of Irish immigrants that sailed across the Atlantic, James Bulger left the west of Ireland in the early 1900s. He made the journey to Boston, where he met and married an Irish girl called Jean McCarthy. In 1929, their first child, James Jr., was born, and the young couple's future looked bright. But their happiness was short-lived.
The father, James Bulger Sr., was just a standard laborer, and he lost his arm in an industrial accident in the 1920s. So the family descended into fairly abject poverty. The first public housing project in the United States of America was opened in South Boston in 1936. The Bulgers moved into it, and that's where they grew up.
Although there were only 4 years between Jimmy and Billy, it was clear from an early age that they were very different. While Billy excelled in his studies, Jimmy was more interested in what he could learn on the streets.
I remember interviewing people that they remember Whitey always as a young man. This is before he became what you would consider a criminal, just driving around in a open-top convertible. He was, the James Dean, the sort of the rebel and the sort of tough guy. But he also was recalled by people as sort of the guy that would stick up for the kid that was getting picked on. So even at that young age, he was sort of building what I would call kind of the Robin Hood reputation he might be a son of a bitch, but he's our son of a bitch.
By the time Billy was winning scholarships to college, Whitey had dropped out of school, and in 1948, he enlisted in the military. But trouble had a habit of following him.
He went into the Air Force, and he was just a disciplinary problem from day one. I got to look at his disciplinary records from the Air Force, and he was accused of rape. He was actually thrown in the military brig in Montana. He beat the rape charge, and when he was up on the charges, he was told by the captain, said, "If we find you guilty, you'll get a dishonorable discharge and you won't be able to get a job when you get out of the military." And Whitey just laughed at him and said, the kind of work I'm going into, I don't need an honorable or a dishonorable discharge. He was involved with a gang of bank robbers that worked various states. They worked as far west as Indiana. And he was finally captured.
In 1955, Whitey was arrested and sentenced to 20 years in prison for his part in bank robberies in 4 different states. When he entered the Atlanta penitentiary, he was 26 years old and was prepared to do whatever it took to shorten his sentence.
It was a very controversial program involving the testing of LSD and testing it on prison inmates in the United States to see the effects. It was something that the U.S. government did quite secretly for what they would consider national security reasons. And, when we were doing the research back in the 80s, we found that Bulger had actually volunteered for this project with the expectation that it would reduce his sentence by a certain amount of time.
Some of the prisoners tested on ended up insane. Others, like Bulger, stopped sleeping and became very violent. The tests were stopped, but Bulger's behavior was still problematic, and he was shipped off to a new home, Alcatraz. With no hope of escape, Whitey developed an interest in reading, and one book in particular captured his imagination. Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince became Whitey Bulger's Bible, and in it, he discovered ways of obtaining power through whatever means necessary.
A prince should therefore have no other aim or thought, nor take up any other thing for his study, but war and its organization and disciplines. For that is the only art necessary to one who commands.
When James Bulger went off to prison, he was a certain type of criminal, but when he came back in the late 60s, he was a different type of criminal. He was smarter, much more Machiavellian, had reached the conclusion that you wouldn't necessarily gain what you needed through brute force, that it had to be a combination of brute force and also a strategy. And so when he reapplied his newfound intellectual skills to the neighborhood, you begin to see Jimmy Bulger become Whitey Bulger.
Bulger might have transformed himself in prison, but the Boston underworld had also changed while he'd been away.
There was a gang war in the early 60s in which well over 50, 60 guys were murdered. Had Whitey been on the street, there was a statistical chance that he would have been one of those guys that get killed. A lot of potential rivals were literally taken off the count. So when he got out there, there was more opportunity for a guy like him. He could reestablish himself quickly.
Whitey just sort of got back into the rackets. He was an enforcer or a collector, a muscle guy for a guy named Donald Killeen. The Killeen brothers worked out of the lower end in South Boston. They had a bar called the Transit Cafe. They pretty much had control of the rackets in Southie.
But the Killeens weren't the only gang operating in Southie. And in his first year back on the streets, Whitey got caught up in a gang war between the Killeens and the Mullins.
There was personality conflict between the Mullen gang. We were a loosely organized bunch of thieves, you know. We hijacked trucks, we robbed. The Killeen gang, they were more of the traditional organized crime. Whitey worked for them. He wasn't the boss or anything. You know, we weren't overly impressed with him. He was a sharp guy, you know, stayed in good shape, liked fancy clothes. Had a overinflated opinion of himself, we thought, at the time, but we weren't impressed with him.
In the years to come, Whitey Bulger and Pat Nee would often work together as criminals. But for now, they were enemies in a gang war, which the Mullins were winning. In 1972, the Killeens' boss, Donald Killeen, was murdered at his son's birthday party.
Entrepreneurs are simply those who understand that there is little difference between obstacle and opportunity, and are able to turn both to their advantage.
Now, Whitey Bulger was never charged with murdering Donnie Killeen, but I remember even hearing this when I was a kid, that Whitey Bulger was given credit for that murder, that the word on the street was that he killed Donnie Killeen, that he took out a guy that had controlled a lot of the rackets in Southie, and this allowed him to be seen as the heir apparent to Donnie Killeen, which was actually the genius of Whitey Bulger. Even the mere perception that he took out Donnie Killeen, and actually took him out in about as ruthless and as callous and as calculated a way that scared people and said that this is a bad guy. And if you cross him, he'll shoot you. And if he has to shoot you outside your little kid's birthday party, he'll do that too.
With the removal of their boss, the Killeen gang was finished. A meeting was called between the city's various criminal factions to try and broker a truce between the Mullins and Whitey Bulger.
I arranged a get-together with Whitey through the Winter Hill gang and the Mafia guys. They sponsored him, so we couldn't kill him under those circumstances. And Howie Winters from the Winter Hill gang, he sponsored us, so he couldn't kill us. You know, that's how you do it. You know, there's like a guarantee from a higher power, if you want, that there be no treachery involved.
Men rise from one ambition to another. First, they seek to secure themselves against attack, and then they attack others.
Jim Bulger moved aside the last remnants of the Killeens formed a partnership with Patney and the last remnants of the Mullen Gang, also forged a partnership with the Winter Hill Gang and Howie Winter, and really consolidated spheres of power that by the time the dust settled would put Whitey Bulger on an equal plane with the Mafia faction in Boston.
Whitey Bulger was running things in Southie now, and within 10 years, his allies in the Winter Hill Gang and his rivals in the Mafia would be eliminated. And it would all be done for him by the FBI. In the 1970s in Boston, Whitey and Billy Bulger were rising stars. Whitey was running the rackets in Southie, and Billy had been elected to the state senate and was earning a reputation as a ruthless politician.
Bill Bulger had a reputation in his world that in some ways matched Whitey's in the underworld. I mean, Bill Bulger was not someone you wanted to cross politically. There'd be payback politically.
He got into politics very early, when Jimmy was still not a major gangland figure. But, you know, at some point, it was pretty obvious that Jimmy Bulger was never coming back to the right side of the law. And so then Billy Bulger's loyalty, I think, then was much more from a brotherly sense.
I would imagine any brother that loved a brother would try to protect them. How far he would go to protect him? I don't think Billy Bulger would break the law to protect him. I don't think that Jim Bulger would put him in that position to do that. But again, what wouldn't you do for your brother?
I think Billy wanted Whitey taken care of, and people have testified in Congress, and Billy has said it didn't happen, but Whitey supposedly told his associates in the gang that Billy had ordered Zip Connolly to take care of Whitey.
Zip was the nickname of John Connolly, a young FBI agent. John Connolly was born and raised in South Boston and knew Whitey Bulger as a child.
They met in a car. Whitey agreed to meet him, and they talked it over. They forged an alliance there, where the FBI was looking for information against the Mafia in Boston. And what does Bulger get out of it? Well, I don't know. No one will ever know exactly what was said at that first meeting. But you know, the bottom line, the thrust of it is if we're busy going after the Mafia, you know, we're not going to have a lot of time to be going after you.
The FBI put Whitey in contact with another top echelon informant, Stephen the Rifleman Flemmi. Bulger and Flemmi formed a partnership, and with the help of the FBI, they ruled the Boston mob for 20 years.
Stevie wasn't one of our guys. Stevie's not from Southie. We never had anything to do with him. We never liked him. Whitey brought him on the scene. And now we know why. They were both informants at the same time for the government.
From the start, Whitey Bulger used the FBI to further his own ends, using them to eliminate anyone who stood in his way.
The first people that he moved against was his own gang, the so-called Winter Hill Gang from Somerville, which was about half Irish and half Italian.
He manipulated himself in there through killing people, through setting people up to go to prison, to setting people up so they have to go on the run. At one point, he had all of us either in prison, fugitives, or dead. And he rose to power. He moved everyone off the board except him and Stevie.
Next to go were the Boston Mafia. In 1983, the Angiulo brothers, who ran the New England mob, were indicted. It was a major coup for the Boston FBI and for John Connolly.
The role Whitey Bulger played in the Boston FBI's efforts to go after the New England Mafia has been vastly overstated. And the one writing the script of that was none other than John Connolly himself, because he needed to. He needed to justify the corrupt dealings he had with Whitey Bulger. And this was a line he used all the time. We would never have toppled the Mafia in New England if not for Whitey Bulger.
The way I looked at it is that really you could justify using Bulger as an informer probably up until the early 80s. Basically, they knew at that point from the early 80s on that when they took out the Italians, the only one that was going to be left standing, who really had juice in this town, who really could make money off the rackets, whether it's extortion, shaking down bookies, loaning money out there through loan sharks. It was Whitey. So at that point, the FBI, in my opinion, was obligated to shake Mr. Bulger's hand and say, we appreciate the relationship, but now, we got to go do our job, and, you're next. Because that's the way it works. But like I said, I think John Conley there were other motives involved, and I think one of them was John Conley's admiration for Billy Bulger.
In 1979, Billy Bulger had been elected as president of the state senate and was now one of the most powerful politicians in Boston. He was hugely popular in Southie's working-class neighborhoods. The Bulgers were seen as their protectors. Billy looked out for them in City Hall, and Whitey took care of them on the streets.
Whitey Bulger is the stuff of legend, and in this hard-scrabble Irish enclave, Whitey Bulger has a lot of friends.
I see him out there, helping out the community, boarding up houses that do drugs and sell drugs.
There was this myth, and a lot of his defenders, including his brother, would say that, he doesn't involve himself in drugs. There was that, like I said, that sort of, he was a gangster, he was a mobster, but he would never sully himself by getting involved in drugs. I lived in South Boston throughout most of the 80s. There was as much coke, if not more per capita, in this town, in South Boston, than there was in any other part of the city.
Directly involved in drugs, he wasn't. What he would do was he would find people that were selling drugs, large quantities of drugs, and make them pay him for the right to sell these drugs. He extorted them. He didn't condone drugs, but he figured drugs was here, so he might as well make money off it.
There's several key pieces of the myths involving the myth of Whitey Bulger, one being the Robin Hood, one being he kept drugs out of Southie. I think the most stunning piece of it was that Whitey was the ultimate stand-up guy. That was his reputation. That went right to his Irish heritage, the Southie neighborhood. They could never catch him because they could never turn anybody in his organization. He kept things very close to the vest, trusted only a very inner circle of people like Stephen Fleming, Kevin Weeks, who became known as Whitey's surrogate son.
Kevin Weeks started working with Whitey Bulger in the 1970s, and for the next 20 years, he was one of his closest associates.
He was dedicated to crime. He was, 95% of his waking hours was dedicated to crime. That's all he thought about. Committing crime, getting away with crime, outthinking people. And so while other people were out on the weekends drinking and partying or whatever, or relaxing, he was thinking about crime. And he was an intelligent man, and he stayed on top of everything.
Weeks soon realized how Whitey Bulger operated, using blackmail, violence, intimidation, and murder.
There was victims that were killed for basically old beefs that were looked to be settled. People that weren't criminals but had one way or another crossed Jim Bulger and Stevie Fleming. And then there was people that they killed just they didn't like or they didn't trust. 2 women were killed, and there was no reason for it other than Stevie Fleming, his ego. He couldn't let them go.
These were girlfriends of his partner in crime, another serial killer, Stevie Fleming. And one of them was basically Stevie Fleming's stepdaughter, who he had been having sex with since the age of 14.
Well, that was Deborah Hussey. And that was the girl that was involved with Stevie Fleming's stepdaughter. And Stevie was having relationships, and she was threatening to tell. And she came into the house, and Jim Bulger started strangling her. Basically, she was dead. And then Stevie Fleming says, no, she's still breathing. And he put a rope around her neck and put a stick through it like a garrote and started strangling her that way, too. There was kind of a competition there, I felt. Who's the better killer?
Whitey would get sexual release from murder. Literally, he would have to lie down on the... These are all things we started seeing by degrees, how sick he really was.
No, I don't think he got sexual release from killing. I was with him when he killed 5 people. I never saw any of that. He enjoyed killing people. And again, like I said, it was like him taking a Valium. It was more of a stress release than it was anything sexual.
During the 1980s, Whitey Bulger's murderous reign spread throughout the city of Boston, and through it all, the FBI protected him from investigation. But people grew suspicious of how Bulger had managed to avoid the authorities.
John Connolly retired in 1990, and they were well on their way to getting away with a couple of decades of murder and mayhem. And the reason I say that is because the Boston Globe published in 1988, 2 years earlier, a series about the Bulger brothers. And in that series, it reported for the first time what we called a special relationship between Whitey Bulger and John Connolly and the Boston FBI. The FBI lied to the public, denying the truth of the story. They flat out denied that Whitey had any special relationship, anything to do with the FBI. So what's a journalist to do at that point?
At John Connolly's retirement dinner, the guest speaker was none other than Billy Bulger.
Fondest memories of him. I met Billy as just a young kid in the neighborhood. He was then, and he is now, a man of integrity and intellect and honor. And I'm proud to call him my friend.
But with Connolly now retiring, he'd no longer be there to protect Billy's brother.
You had a changing of the guard, so to speak. And with that arrived a couple of young prosecutors in the U.S. Attorney's Office. They looked around. They saw Whitey. He's the biggest game in town and has been for years. Why aren't we doing Whitey? And then once they got in, they themselves went through that same experience that so many of us had. They kept going, holy shit, as they peeled away one layer of the onion after another.
The net was finally closing in on Whitey Bulger, but he had one ace left up his sleeve: John Connolly.
Well, it was 2 days before Christmas, and John Connolly come down, and he was looking for Jim Bulger or Stevie Fleming, neither one of them around. And that's when he told me about the indictments coming down, and they were going to try to pick them up over the holidays and arrest them all at the same time. So when I left there, I beeped Jim Bulger, met him, told him, and he left.
Whitey Bulger went on the run on December 23, 1994, something he had been planning for a long time.
He had started back in the early 80s, establishing an ID and different offshore accounts and everything. He was, looking ahead the whole time.
The feds have discovered safe deposit boxes in Italy, the UK, Dublin, Canada, Florida. I mean, and those are the ones they found. I mean, who knows how many more are out there?
He also had an Irish passport, which would have allowed him quick access through any number of the EU countries. But he knew that the day of reckoning was eventually coming.
One by one, the authorities took down everyone involved in Whitey Bulger's web of crime and corruption. Steve Fleming was sentenced to life in prison. Kevin Weeks was arrested, and to avoid life imprisonment, he cut a deal with the authorities that saw him released after 5 years. Connolly is now serving a 40-year prison term at a state prison in Chipley, Florida. Billy Bulger still lives in Southie. Whitey Bulger, who was on the run for more than 16 years, was captured in California in 2011. He is currently serving 2 consecutive life sentences for his crimes.
Whitey's the last of the last. There's no question about that. In fact, in many ways, the saga of the Irish-American gangster by the 1970s and 80s in Southie with Whitey Bulger and in Hell's Kitchen with the Westies is almost the reverse of what it was when it first began back in the latter decades of the 19th century. Back then, you could make the argument that the underworld, the mob, was a means to an end. It was an avenue of advancement that was utilized by the Irish and other ethnic groups that arrived in the United States. And that advancement took place for the Irish over the course of the 20th century. And so the Irish as a people, as a group, really didn't need organized crime anymore. It no longer served that function.